The Ferryman. The Kaitho had a word for what happened to a body once medicine stopped being able to help it. They did not have a word for what Naomi Cole did afterward, because in 400 years of interstellar medicine, no species in the Confederacy had ever thought there was anything left to do. "You misunderstand the assignment," Dr. Kaitho said on Naomi's first morning aboard the Providence, reviewing her transfer file with the particular flatness of someone confirming a clerical error rather than meeting a new colleague. Chief medical officer of a frontier hospital ship, decorated, precise, 400 years of Kaitho medical tradition distilled into a single unhurried voice. Palliative specialist. I have read the term, I do not understand what it describes. Once a patient's prognosis becomes terminal, care transitions to comfort, sedation, and isolation, so that the remaining hours pass without distress and without imposing the decline on staff or family. This is standard across every species in the Confederacy that has bothered to formalize end-of-life protocol at all. What precisely is left for a specialist to specialize in? "Staying," Naomi said. Kaitho's antennae, delicate glass-like structures that betrayed emotion the Kaitho's carefully neutral faces never did, twitched with something that might have been confusion or might have been the Kaitho equivalent of contempt. "Staying," she repeated. "Sitting with someone while they die," Naomi said. "Not sedating them into a version of dying where nobody has to witness it. Being there, holding a hand if they want one held, talking if they want to talk, or just being quiet in the room if they don't, making sure the last thing a person experiences isn't isolation." She met Kaitho's flat, unreadable gaze without flinching from it. "On Earth, we've had a name for it for a long time. Hospice. The Confederacy asked for a human specialist because apparently nobody else in 400 years of medicine has built anything like it." "That is not medicine," Kaitho said. "That is sentiment." "Maybe," Naomi said. "I've never found a good reason those have to be different things." She'd taken the posting 11 months after her husband died in a hospital room on Earth that smelled like antiseptic and the last of the season's cut flowers someone had brought too early. And she had learned, in the 6 weeks between his diagnosis and the end of it, exactly how much a hand meant when there was nothing else left to give. David hadn't been afraid of dying, not really, not by the end. He'd been afraid of dying alone, of the machines going quiet in an empty room, of some overnight shift nurse finding him gone hours later with no one having noticed the exact moment it happened. Naomi had promised him that wouldn't happen, and she had kept the promise, the only way a promise like that can be kept. She had simply never left the room, not for 6 weeks, not once. She remembered more clearly than almost anything else from that year, a night in the 3rd week when the pain medication had finally found the right balance, and David had been lucid and almost peaceful for a few hours, and they had talked, not about dying, not about any of the things the hospital pamphlets suggested dying people and their families were supposed to talk about, but about the terrible restaurant they'd gotten engaged in, and whether their cat had ever actually liked either of them or just tolerated them for the food, and a vacation to a beach town they'd always meant to take and never had. He'd fallen asleep holding her hand in the middle of a sentence about the cat, and she had sat there for another 2 hours afterward, not moving, not because he needed her to, but because some part of her had finally understood that this, the staying, the small ordinary conversation, the refusal to let dying become the only subject in the room, was itself a kind of gift, maybe the only one still available to give. His hand went slack in hers for the last time 5 weeks after that, on a Tuesday morning, with the sun coming up wrong-colored through hospital blinds, and she had understood, in the raw, unbearable quiet afterward, that she had just done the single most important thing she would ever do for another human being, and that almost nobody in the wider universe had any idea such a thing was possible to offer. She had spent the year after his death training other hospice workers, and the year after that training their trainers, and by the time the Confederacy's outreach office had come looking for a human specialist in what their formal request called terminal phase palliative methodology, human variant, currently unduplicated elsewhere in known space, Naomi Cole had become, without ever setting out to, one of the foremost experts in a discipline the rest of the galaxy hadn't known it was missing. She thought about David every time she sat down beside a dying stranger. It never stopped hurting. She had come to understand, slowly, that it wasn't supposed to. Her first patient aboard the Providence was a Kaitho soldier barely out of training, gutted by shrapnel in a border skirmish nobody back home would ever hear the name of, given 6 hours by the ship's diagnostic systems, and immediately scheduled for comfort, sedation, and isolation per standard protocol. Naomi asked to see him first. There is no purpose to that, the attending physician told her, not unkindly, simply confused. Sedation begins within the hour. He will feel nothing after that. Speaking with him now serves no medical function. It's not for him, Naomi said. It's for the 6 hours before the sedation, when he's still awake and still afraid, and doesn't know anyone's coming. She didn't wait for permission. That wasn't going to arrive through official channels. She went in anyway. The soldier's name was Yel Korvath, 22, Kaitho years old, which she'd learn later put him somewhere in his early 20s by Earth reckoning too. Young in every language, young enough that his hands, when she took one of them without asking first and watched carefully for the recoil that never came, were still smooth in a way that made the wound in his side look like a mistake someone would surely correct any minute. "You are not required to be here," he said in the careful, formal, confederated standard the Kaitho favored even in extremity. "Protocol does not assign a companion for this." "I know," Naomi said. "I'm not here because of protocol. I'm here because nobody should have to do this part by themselves if they don't want to." She settled into the chair beside his bed, made no move to leave, made it clear through the simple fact of staying that she had nowhere else more important to be. "Do you want to talk, or would you rather I just sit here?" He was quiet for a long moment, something in his composed young face working through an idea he clearly had no established framework for. "I do not know what we would talk about," he finally admitted. "Then tell me about your mother," Naomi said. "Or the first thing you remember loving, or nothing at all, if you'd rather. I'm not going anywhere, Yel. Whatever the next 6 hours look like, you don't have to spend them alone." He talked, in the end, for almost 4 of those 6 hours, about a mother on a farming world he'd never see again, about a sister he'd fought with the week before shipping out and never gotten to apologize to, about small, unremarkable things that clearly mattered more to him in that room than they ever had anywhere else. Naomi listened to all of it, held his hand through the parts where his voice broke, and when the sedation finally came, administered at his own request once he'd said everything he needed to say, he went under with his hand still in hers, and something on his face that the attending physician, reviewing the readings afterward, described in his notes as an anomaly. His neurological markers in the final hour, the physician told Kaitho later, in a debrief neither of them had expected to need, were consistent with calm, not sedation-induced calm, something that happened before the sedation began. Kaitho's response to the anomaly was not curiosity, it was containment. "You will submit a request through my office before entering any terminal case going forward," she told Naomi the following morning, in a tone that made clear the instruction wasn't open for negotiation. "This ship runs on triage logic, Specialist Cole. Every hour a physician or trainee spends attending a single dying patient is an hour not spent on cases where intervention still has a chance of mattering. I will not have my staff's attention redirected towards sentiment merely because one case produced an interesting readout. "I'm not asking your staff to do anything," Naomi said. "I'm doing it myself. You are aboard my ship, operating under my medical authority, and every hour you spend in a terminal ward is an hour the Confederacy is paying for under the assumption it serves this vessel's mission." Kaitho's antennae held rigid, controlled. "I have permitted the arrangement because the treaty that placed you here obligates me to. I have not been persuaded it is medicine. Until I am, you will operate within limits I set, not limits you decide for yourself." Naomi accepted the restriction without argument because arguing wasn't going to move a 400-year-old doctrine any faster than patience would, and for the following 2 months, she worked within exactly the boundaries Kaitho drew. A handful of approved cases a week, logged, reviewed, treated by the rest of the medical staff, as a curiosity tolerated rather than a practice respected. She kept doing the work anyway, in the narrow space she'd been given, and let the results speak for themselves, one quiet room at a time. Word moved through the Providence, the way it always moves through a ship too small to keep real secrets. Not as gossip exactly, but as a slow accumulation of small witnessed things nobody quite knew how to categorize yet. A junior medical technician mentioned, in the mess hall, that the dying Kaitho soldier hadn't screamed the way the last 3 terminal patients had in the moments before sedation took hold. Someone else remembered that the human specialist had been in the room the whole time. Nobody said the 2 facts were connected. Everyone started thinking it anyway. Ensign Piru found her 3 days later, hovering with the particular anxious energy of the Vantic, small, quick, feather-scaled creatures whose entire culture had been built, for longer than recorded Vantic history, around a single unbending principle. Witnessing death was spiritually contaminating, a stain that passed from the dying to whoever remained close enough to see it happen. Vantic children were kept from funerals. Vantic elders, when their time came, were moved to isolation chambers weeks in advance, tended by machines, visited by no one, so that the living could remain untouched by whatever the dying carried with them at the end. "You sat with him," Piru said, without preamble, the words coming out clipped and uncertain. "The soldier. You were in the room the entire time he was dying." "I was," Naomi said. "Did it?" Piru's feathers along the back of the neck rose slightly, an involuntary Vantic tell for distress Naomi had already learned to read. "Did it transfer to you? The contamination? Is that why humans developed this practice? Because your species found some way to survive proximity to death that ours never has?" Naomi set down the medical log she'd been reviewing and gave the ensign her full attention. "There's no contamination, Piru. I'm not immune to something your people are vulnerable to. I just don't believe dying is something that should have to happen alone, and neither did anyone who taught me. It isn't a survival skill. It's a choice a person makes about what kind of company they're willing to be." Piru was quiet for a long moment, feathers slowly settling. "My grandmother died 3 years ago," the ensign finally said very softly, "in an isolation chamber, exactly the way our custom requires. I was not permitted to see her in her final days. I have spent 3 years believing that was a mercy, sparing myself something dangerous, sparing her the burden of my presence." Something cracked, very slightly, in the careful composure. "I do not know what to do with the idea that it might have only been a habit nobody ever questioned." "You don't have to do anything with it today," Naomi said gently. "But if you ever want to learn how to sit with someone, the way I sat with Yel Korvath, I'll teach you. It's not a human secret. It never should have been anyone's secret. It's just something somebody has to be willing to go first on, in a culture that's never tried it before." Piru didn't answer right away, but 3 days later, the ensign was in the doorway of Naomi's next terminal case, watching, learning, feathers held tight against a fear that hadn't gone anywhere but had, for the first time in Piru's life, been outweighed by something else. It took 6 more weeks before Naomi judged the ensign ready to sit alone with a dying patient for the first time. A Confederated logistics officer, elderly by his own species reckoning, with no family aboard and no one else requesting to be present. Piru had asked to take the case unsupervised, and Naomi, against every instinct that wanted to hover in the doorway the way the ensign once had, made herself stay outside and let it happen without her. She found Piru afterward in the corridor, feathers trembling, eyes wet in the way Vantic physiology expressed something closer to overwhelm than grief. "I was so frightened the entire time," Piru admitted. "I kept waiting to feel the contamination everyone always warned me about. It never came. All that came was—" The ensign struggled for the word. "Him, just him telling me about a granddaughter he'd never met because his duty kept him too far from home too long, and me listening, and somehow that was enough to matter. I don't understand how 3 years of my own culture's certainty could have been so completely wrong." "It wasn't stupidity," Naomi said. "It was just untested. Most bad ideas aren't cruel on purpose, Piru. They're just old, and nobody's gotten around to questioning them yet. You just did the questioning for your entire species, 3 months into a job you were terrified to start." To Kaitho did not convert easily. 400 years of Kaithir medical doctrine did not bend for a single anomalous case, however well documented, and Kaitho spent the following 2 months treating Naomi's presence aboard the Providence with the careful, correct professional distance of someone withholding judgment on a hypothesis she still expected to fail. What broke the distance in the end wasn't a debate. It was a patient, a Kaithir engineer named Sorel Vantha, 60 years into a distinguished career, terminal from an engine containment failure that had cost him both legs and most of his remaining time, who requested, against every instinct his own species protocol had trained into him, that the human specialist be present for his final hours, instead of the standard sedation and isolation his medical file already had cued. "I have read the reports," Sorel told Kaitho with the specific stubbornness of a dying man who had earned the right to a few unreasonable requests. "I am aware this is unconventional. I would like it anyway. I do not wish to spend my last hours alone in a dark room being managed. I would like to spend them being known, for however long there is left to be known in." Kaitho, who had personally trained under Sorel Vantha 2 decades earlier, who owed the man more of her career than she had ever found occasion to say aloud, authorized the request herself and then, without quite deciding to, found herself standing in the doorway of the room for the whole of it, not participating, not yet, just watching, the way Piru had watched 3 months before. Naomi didn't perform for the audience. She simply did what she always did, sat close, held the hand that wanted holding, asked about a life instead of measuring the end of one, let silences be silences instead of filling them with anything false. Sorrel talked about the ships he'd built, the students he'd trained, a wife 3 decades gone whose name he said out loud for what he told them, smiling faintly, was probably the first time in years. He died with his old student watching from the doorway and a stranger's hand in his, and the calm that settled over the room in his final minutes was not the manufactured calm of sedation. It was something else, something Kaitho, watching, found she did not have adequate Kathir vocabulary to fully describe. "I have practiced medicine for 400 years, Kaitho said afterward, standing in the corridor outside the room she couldn't quite bring herself to leave yet. "I have overseen thousands of terminal cases. I did not know until this hour that there was a difference between managing a death and attending one." She looked at Naomi with an expression that had finally, fully, stopped being clinical. "I would like you to teach this, not informally, not as an ensign's private curiosity, formally, to every member of this crew willing to learn it." "I'd like that too," Naomi said. She built the curriculum the way she'd built it once before, on Earth, in the years after David, not as a technical protocol but as a discipline of presence, teachable in principle but only truly learnable by doing it, badly at first, in a real room, with a real dying stranger who deserved better than a trainee's fear getting in the way. Piru became her first formal student, then 3 more crew members from 4 different species, then a dozen, the Providence culture shifting by slow degrees around a practice that had no name in any language aboard the ship except the one Naomi had brought with her. Some of the crew started calling her the Ferryman, half in jest at first, a joke about old Earth mythology someone had looked up, a figure who carried the dying across whatever boundary waited on the other side of the last breath. It stopped being a joke within a few months. By the time the name had fully taken root, it wasn't mockery anymore. It was closer to reverence, the kind reserved for someone who did a necessary thing nobody else had been willing to do first. Naomi let herself feel proud of that, on the good days. On the harder ones, and there were harder ones, more than she let most of the crew see, she thought about David, and about how strange it was that the worst 6 weeks of her life had somehow become the foundation for the best work she had ever done, and she let herself grieve him again, quietly, in the narrow hour before sleep, because she had learned a long time ago that grief handled honestly didn't diminish with use, it just found new rooms to live in. The attack came without enough warning for anyone to have done anything differently. A raiding fleet from beyond the Confederacy's eastern border hit the Providence escort convoy in open space, and though the hospital ship itself was marked, protected, explicitly off-limits under every treaty the Confederacy had ever signed, treaties meant nothing to raiders who saw a slow-moving medical vessel as an easy prize rather than a protected one. The Providence took 2 direct hits before the escort could drive the attackers off, one along the outer ring that buckled 3 wards and killed the ship's redundant power routing outright, one lower, deeper, through a section of the hull that had never been designed to take a direct strike at all. Emergency lighting cast the corridors in a flat red that made every face of every species aboard look already halfway toward whatever came next. In the space of 11 minutes, the number of terminal patients aboard the ship went from the ordinary handful Naomi's small, growing team could manage individually to more than 60, spread across 5 wards that no longer had reliable comms between them. There was no version of her practice built to survive that math. She understood it within the first hour, standing in a triage corridor lined with more dying strangers than she had hands or hours to hold, and for one terrible, paralyzing minute she felt something close to what Kaitho must have felt on the day Naomi first arrived. The sense of a discipline meeting a scale it was never designed for. Then Piru found her in the corridor, feathers flat with a calm that hadn't existed in the ensign 3 months earlier, and said the thing that saved what Naomi had built from collapsing under its own weight in the 1 hour it mattered most. "You taught 12 of us," Piru said. "We're not as good as you yet. We will never be as good as you, but we don't have to be as good as you today. We just have to be there, all of us, as many rooms as we can cover." The ensign's voice didn't waver. "Tell us where to go." They split the ship between them. Naomi, Piru, 10 trainees barely 6 weeks into a discipline none of them had mastered, moving room to room through a hospital ship crowded with the dying, doing the only thing any of them could reliably do under conditions that had outpaced every other resource the Providence had left, staying, holding hands, saying names, making sure that of the 61 people who died aboard the Providence that night, not one of them did it in a room with nobody in it. Naomi didn't sleep for 31 hours. She would remember almost none of the individual rooms afterward. In the specific way trauma sometimes mercifully blurs its own worst edges. Just an unbroken sequence of hands and names, and the particular exhausted grace of showing up for one more stranger when there was nothing left in her to give, and she gave it anyway. She would remember one room with perfect, unbearable clarity. Ensign Peru had been in the outer ring when the second hit landed, running triage assignments between the Providence's wards with the same tireless calm that had carried the entire crew through the worst hour of the attack, and a support strut weakened by the first impact had come down across the corridor exactly as Peru passed beneath it. Naomi found her student 2 hours later, once the immediate chaos had finally thinned enough to account for everyone, in a bed in the same ward where Peru had once stood, terrified in a doorway, learning for the first time that death didn't have to happen in isolation. The injuries were not survivable. The ship's remaining medical staff had already said as much, in the careful, exhausted language doctors use when there's nothing left to offer but honesty. "You don't have to stay," Peru said when Naomi sat down in the chair beside the bed, small feathered hand already reaching, unprompted, for hers. "You've been in 40 rooms tonight. You must be—" "I have exactly enough left for one more," Naomi said, and took the offered hand, and did not let go of it again. They didn't talk about the war, or the ship, or the 60 other rooms Naomi had already sat in that night. Peru wanted to talk about the grandmother, 3 years gone, mourned alone in an isolation chamber, a death the ensign had spent 3 years believing was a mercy, and had spent the last 3 months slowly understanding was simply a habit nobody had questioned soon enough. "I keep thinking," Peru said, voice thin now, fading in the way Naomi had learned to recognize without needing the monitors to confirm it, "that if I had known then what I know now, if our people had known, generations ago, that this was even possible, she wouldn't have had to be alone. None of them would have. They know now," Naomi said, steady, present, refusing to let her own voice do anything but hold. "Because of you. 12 people on this ship know how to do this because you were the first one brave enough to stand in a doorway and ask a question you were afraid of the answer to. Whatever happens on every ship after this one, Peru, that starts with you. It already has." Peru's grip tightened, faint but real, the last of it. "Will you say my name?" the ensign asked. "At the end. I don't know why that matters to me, but it does." "Peru," Naomi said, and kept saying it, softly, steadily, a small, unbroken thread of sound in a room that had learned, because of the person dying in it, exactly how not to let anyone go alone, until the hand in hers finally, gently, stopped holding on, and Naomi Cole sat in the quiet afterward and let herself cry, fully and without apology, for the first time since David, for a student who had taught her, in the end, at least as much as she had ever taught in return. Dr. Kaitho found her there an hour later and did not ask her to leave, and did not offer the clinical distance she'd have offered 6 months earlier. She simply sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed and after a long, wordless while, reached across and put a hand, Kaithia careful and unpracticed, over Naomi's. "You have spent this entire posting teaching a ship full of strangers not to let each other die alone," Kaitho said. "I would ask that you extend the same courtesy to yourself, occasionally. You do not have to carry all 61 rooms by yourself, Naomi. Not tonight, and not going forward. You built something larger than one person now. Let it hold you the way you have spent 6 months teaching it to hold everyone else." Naomi didn't answer right away, but she didn't pull her hand away either, and some while later, when Peru's body had been moved with the honor the ship's whole crew now understood how to offer, she let Kaitho walk her back to her own quarters, and did not spend that particular night entirely alone. The Confederacy formally adopted a fleet-wide comfort care doctrine 11 months later, built almost entirely from the curriculum Naomi had first taught to a frightened, curious ensign in a hospital corridor on a ship called the Providence. Every med ship in Confederated service now carried at least one trained companion specialist. Every species medical academy now offered, however reluctantly some of the older institutions had come to it, a course in what the official Confederated documentation still called, in careful deference to the tradition it had borrowed from, terminal phase presence, human methodology. Dr. Kaitho delivered the doctrine's founding address herself, before a chamber of Confederated medical delegates who had spent 400 years believing dignity and distance were the same thing. She did not speak like a physician defending a hypothesis. She spoke like someone who had sat once in a doorway she'd never expected to still be standing in an hour later, watching a colleague teach a dying friend how to not be afraid. "I built my career on the belief that medicine's obligation to a patient ended at the point treatment could no longer help them," Kaitho told the assembled delegates. "I have spent the last several years unlearning that one room at a time, taught by a specialist from a species we once assumed had nothing to offer this Confederacy beyond curiosity value. I was wrong about the limits of medicine. I suspect a great many of us have been wrong about the same thing for considerably longer than we've been willing to admit." She paused, and, for a species that rarely allowed sentiment into a formal address, what came next carried unmistakable weight. "We called her the Ferryman aboard the Providence. I would ask this chamber to consider that every ship in this fleet deserves one." The vote passed within the week. On 100 different worlds and vessels across Confederated space, medical staff who had never once questioned the old protocol began sitting, awkwardly at first, and then with growing confidence, in rooms they had once been trained to leave. Naomi stayed aboard the Providence another 6 years after that, training 3 more generations of companions, sitting in more rooms than she ever fully counted, carrying every name forward the way she'd promised David she would carry his. She thought of Piru often, in the doorway of every new trainee's first terminal case, in the particular steadiness she'd learned to hold in her own voice at exactly the moment it mattered most, in a small brass nameplate the crew had, without asking her, mounted quietly outside the ward where the ensign had died, reading simply, "Here no one goes alone," in memory of Ensign Piru, first among the ferrymen. She was old, by human standards, the year her own diagnosis came, a slow decline, nothing dramatic, the kind of ending she'd spent her whole career teaching others how to sit inside of with grace instead of terror. She did not go to a Confederated hospital ship for it. She went home, to Earth, to a small house that still smelled faintly of a life she'd built twice, once with David, once with everyone who'd come after him. And she was not afraid because she understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what waited for her at the end of it. She was not alone. Piru's successors had made sure of that. 3 generations of trained companions from a dozen species scattering back across the Confederacy, carrying a discipline that had started with 1 grieving widow and 1 frightened ensign, and had, by the end, quietly rewired what an entire galaxy believed it owed its dying. Naomi Cole died on a Tuesday morning, sun coming up wrong-colored through blinds that reminded her, in the last clear moment she had for it, of another Tuesday morning decades and 1 whole universe of grief ago. A hand in hers the entire time, exactly as she'd have wanted it, exactly as she'd taught an entire galaxy it was always supposed to be. Nobody had to be told to stay. By then, no one who'd ever learned her name would have considered doing anything else. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.